The State of Crypto is presented by Tron, connecting the world to the power of cryptocurrency.
But the drama wasn't just in the markets, it was also somewhere else. So the SEC chair, Gary Gensler, was in the hot seat just yesterday. He refused to say whether Ether was a security during a nearly 5-hour hearing, and I did not count the number of times he was asked that question. Take a listen to this particular exchange with Republican Congressman and Chair of the House Financial Services Committee, Patrick Henry.
Is Ether a commodity or a security?
Without speaking to any one.
I know you've repeatedly said you're not going to speak to one, except you've spoken to one, Bitcoin. So I'm asking you to speak to a second one, the second largest market cap here.
And speaking to the tokens, there's 10 to 12,000. If there's a group of entrepreneurs in the
asking
middle,
about one.
The public is anticipating a profit based on the...
I'm asking you a specific question, Chair Gensler. I said this in private. This should be no shock to you. I'm asking this question. Is Ether a commodity or a security?
And again, it depends on the facts and the law, and if there's a group of individuals...
I'm asking you about the facts and the law sitting in your seat and the judgment you are making.
And so, Mr. Chair, I think you would not want me to prejudge because I'm also...
But you have prejudged on this.
All right, we're going to put two other people in the hot seat now. Joining us to discuss this is a man who has served with the SEC as a lawyer for 10 years, Moses Senior Partner and former SEC Senior Trial Counsel, Howard Fischer, and Joshua Ashley Klayman, Linklaters U.S. Head of Blockchain and Digital Assets. Joshua, particularly to you, thanks so much for joining at short notice. We appreciate that. I'm going to start with Howard, though. Your impression of the hours-long hearing and particularly this exchange on whether Ether is a security or not?
Well, first of all, it's clear that there's no love lost between the chair and the Republicans on the committee, and this is really no surprise. It has been a contentious relationship since the change in the power structure in the House, and it's only going to continue, and I think it reflects a fundamental difference in how the SEC views digital assets and how many of the House Republicans and Democrats as well view digital assets as well. And the exchange about Ether is just one example of this. The House, many Republicans in the House, and Democrats as well, to be fair, believe that the SEC is stifling innovation, impeding American entrepreneurialism, and driving digital asset industry off seas. That is a concern for them. For the SEC, however, their main concern is protecting investors and protecting market integrity. So I think the exchange on Ether is just one aspect of a very different view of what the agency should be doing and what Congress should be doing.
But then why is it that in the past the SEC has more or less indicated that Ether is a security but refused to do that in this setting?
I think that Chairman Gensler is a little concerned, as he said, about prejudging the issue. He didn't come off that well in that exchange, quite frankly, but I think that he's concerned that if he says one way or the other, that's going to be used against him in a later proceeding.
Hey, Josh, how are you?
Great, how are you?
Good seeing you again. Why is Gensler like this? I mean, this is not a guy who's never heard of Ether. I mean, this is a guy who taught the class at MIT. He knows what Ether is. How come he's acting like maybe there's this Ether, I heard about it, someone told me, I don't know the facts, this is complicated, I got to do some more research. Why is he acting like this? The guy knows what it is.
I mean, I think this was the best the industry could have hoped for from him. I mean, really, he could have said everything but Bitcoin, is a security, and he didn't. And I think part of it is, we talk about facts and circumstances. Well, that cuts both ways, right? The facts and circumstances can make one particular instance look like there is the existence of an investment contract and therefore a security, but it can also be used to defend against that. So I think as Chairman Gensler has been exploring this idea that post-merge Ethereum may be a security, right? Certainly in his speeches and things like that. We don't know all the facts. And so I think for the industry, having him say, it comes down to facts and circumstances. This is good, in my view, for Ether, but also for a whole host of other digital assets that may need to fight it out in court.
Yeah, but I mean, like the facts for him could be that, oh, this is a security. Post-merge, it is a security because I guess they're getting a yield. The yield is something. It's a return. Therefore, it's a security. So just say it. He's got to know what a merge does. He's got to already know this. I mean, this is like. What's the delay? Why is he holding off?
I think part of this, he's free to say his views and speeches and things like that. Here he is in a hearing, right? And we do know that ultimately whether something is a security or not likely comes down to the courts unless there's a settlement, right? And so he doesn't want to be wrong. I mean, I do think that the questions that he was asked personally, and I'm not one to normally be defending Chairman Gensler, he can defend himself. But I think they were tough questions, and they weren't questions that were going to be able to be satisfied unless a very specific answer was given.
So I guess the question I have for either of you really, one of the things that I believe came up yesterday was somebody said, yeah, even though he's saying this now, he could say something different tomorrow, right? So, Joshua, you just said this is good for the industry, what he said, but couldn't this just change? Like tomorrow he could just come out and say Ether is security, right? I mean, I think that's the fear, is that he's very unpredictable and, this isn't binding in any way. This could just be something he was saying at the time. I mean, are there any chances that this could just kind of reverse itself?
I'll jump in first just to say that I think that this represents the fundamental issue that Congress has, which is that we don't have a defined regulatory framework for determining what's a security, for determining whether or not a digital asset exchange has to register. And in the absence of a defined regulatory structure, either from the SEC or from Congress, what we have is regulation by enforcement, which leads to that kind of uncertainty as to what is a security and to how actors in this industry should behave.
I mean, what I would add to that is, yes, it's possible that Chairman Gensler can say something the next day, but Chairman Gensler doesn't determine whether something is in fact a security. He can share his view, but that's to be determined by a court or by a settlement. And again, it will come down to the facts and circumstances.
Well, Josh, it seems like he does think he can determine whether something is a security, because every time some case is brought before the SEC files a complaint, they all of a sudden list a whole bunch of things and say, oh yeah, these are securities. Yeah. These tokens are all securities. So, I mean, it sort of is like kind of that's what they're doing. Ask the guys at Ripple whether or not he can determine that they're taking him to court now, but I mean, he seems to be pushing that he can determine it. And it's costing a lot of these firms a lot of money to try and defend their case. So, I mean, isn't that, yeah.
Well, playing devil's advocate here, because that's what I'll do. I mean, if we're saying what is the message, his statements are warnings, right? His statements are saying, don't do this. This looks bad. These look like bad facts, right? Maybe don't copy this, other people in the market. And so, again, I definitely think things could go either way. But I do think that the fact that he did equivocate on the answer is a positive for the industry. If he thought it was a slam dunk that Ether was a security, then he would have said it.
So, I wanted to step in here because, Howard, you've been with the SEC for close to a decade. Could you argue, if you played the angel's advocate, that this is actually a negative?
Well, in all fairness, I left the SEC and rejoined private practice before the current onslaught against digital assets. So I'm speaking not as someone who was deeply involved in those cases while I was there. Look, I think the real issue here is that there is a concern at the SEC that the move towards proof of stake is what might make something a security. And I think that the concern that Gensler has about saying that specifically is, on one hand, good for the industry, but on the other hand, it may also reflect the internal processes at the SEC, which simply means that they haven't made up their mind yet, and they're looking at this, and that may be a harbinger of future enforcement activity, which is probably not good.
How Howard, your background at the SEC is useful here for just kind of the bigger picture, because there's so many sort of conspiracy theories out there about Gensler and a lot of, just anger in the crypto community. So I guess my question for you is, and this just your personal opinion, what is Gensler's endgame here? Like, what's going on? Is this, there's a bunch of different theories out there. One is that this is his personal mission. This is his thing. Another is that he's playing some sort of political long game. Another one is that he's kind of empowered, or the SEC is empowered by the Biden administration to kind of take these kind of positions. Like, what is the bigger picture here for the stance that he's taking?
I just want to quickly add to that. Sorry, I just want to quickly add to that. At one point there was a spot where he had started the hearing by saying himself that this is my personal opinion. He did not say that this was his opinion as chair of the SEC or the SEC's opinion. Right. Just to add to that, yeah.
Right, which is what you have to say when you're at the SEC. I mean, believe me, every time you leave the office, you're warned, by the way, when you go home and talk to your wife, say, this is my opinion, not the opinion of the agency. My kids found that very strange, but they got used to that. Look, I think that ultimately the end game has to be that Congress and the SEC get together and realize that it's in everyone's best interest to jointly sit down and work out a regulatory framework which makes sense. Work out a framework which gives the SEC or some oversight agency insight into what's going on at these companies, as they would if they were registered, and also gives those companies and the players in this field some kind of certainty that they could act and that they're not going to be prosecuted for it. That has to be the rational end game, and I would hope that that's the end game that all of the players, both congressional and regulatory, have in mind.
But Howard, as things stand, knowing very well that countries all over the world are trying to figure out what crypto is all about. There's tokenization happening in Australia. You can't expect Congress persons to come up with laws. So as things stand, where does the responsibility lie? At the hands of the SEC when they have decided to take on regulation by enforcement, or at Congress when they've decided to call the SEC's chair and question the hell out of him?
I mean, I think the SEC under this administration has fallen more on the side of viewing its mission as protecting investors and protecting market integrity, as opposed to promoting capital formation, which is also an SEC goal. And as the SEC sees it today, right now, if you look at what the laws say, most crypto products are securities. Most crypto entities are either exchanges or broker-dealers. And if you ask Chairman Gensler or anyone else at the SEC, I think they would simply say that what they're doing is applying the old laws that have existed for 100 years at this point, almost 100 years, and simply applying them to new products. Whether that's wise or not, as a business decision, that's something for Congress to do.
All right, Joshua, I'll leave the last question for you. What's the point of all of this if you still don't have a clarity? Like, how does the conversation move forward? There's a hearing that's coming up later today. It's a stablecoin hearing by the same Republican-led House Financial Services Committee. Like, why should I be watching it for 5 hours when I don't have an answer at the end of it? What does it really do?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know that you necessarily need to watch all 5 hours of it, but what I would say is, regulators would say there is clarity, right? We've been saying, capital, if you're raising capital using a token, you've got a security, for instance. The CFTC has said that virtual assets are commodities, and they can be both commodities and securities at the same time, right? So that's important to remember. What I do think, though, is a lot about these hearings is getting frustrations and getting messages out, right? People are upset. People are frustrated. I mean, we heard not just, okay, you're regulating by enforcement. We also heard yesterday criticisms of, there's too much rulemaking. And so I think there's a lot of frustration. There are a lot of opposing views. And these hearings really provide a forum to vent that, and also for, frankly, legislators to show, look, we're listening, we're paying attention, and here's our view.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Moses Singer, partner and former SEC senior trial counsel Howard Fischer, and of course Joshua Ashley Klayman, Linklaters U.S. head of blockchain and digital assets. It was just great to have both of you. Riveting discussion that was.